It's been a while since we've made something on this channel. We're always about learning new ways to do things, and what better way to learn this feature than by creating this little town. How are we going to do this? Well, using what's called the isometric grid. So if you want to follow along, let's get into it. Alright, so if you do want to follow along with this, I'm going to give you all the kind of pixel widths of the artboard and kind of how we're making this, but feel free to go with what you think looks good as well. So to start with, we're going to make a simple artboard, 600 pixels by 600 pixels, keeping it pretty simple. We hit create. Now personally, what I tend to do, so without actually clicking anything, I just make the artboard itself a darker shade of grey, just because it's easier to look at. It's personal preference. If you want to do it, it's entirely up to you. So like I said, we're going to go through the isometric grid. So we need to first open that little window. So if we head over to window, and down to isometric. Just as a side note, if you're following along in version 1, you would head over to view, studio, and then isometric. But here in version 2, we just go to window and isometric. So open that up and you'll be met with this little window right here. So all we're going to do is we're going to hit modify grid. Now the first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we hit this tick box right here, which says show grid. Without doing this, things are going to become very difficult. Now we do want to keep everything pretty simple, and to do that, we have to go to advanced. So if we select that, there's a bunch of settings in this that you can change, and you can create your own little grid. But like I said, we want to keep this pretty simple. So down this drop down box here, we're just going to select isometric. So right now, because of the grid color that I've selected, you can't really see the grid. So right at the bottom down here, you can change the color. So if we make this something a little bit lighter, so we'll just leave it like that. Usually I have it a lot more transparent. So we're going to up this a little bit just so it's a bit more obvious in this tutorial. And then up here, we've got our spacing. So right now these squares are pretty big. So what we're going to do is we're going to knock this down to something around about like 20-ish. In fact, we could simply just type 20 in there. We can subdivide this as well. So if we subdivided it by 2, you can actually see that we can see some smaller squares within our squares. We don't really need to do this right now. You can always add this in later when you're creating the detail of things. We'll leave it at 1 for now. And like I said, we are going to keep this simple. So that's the grid that we're going to go with. So all we do, hit close at the bottom. You still got this isometric window popped up. Now, if we do want to change this grid again, we can go down to grid settings and reopen those settings and change things around. Make sure that you're pretty happy with the grid that you've got before you start creating a lot of things, because once you change the grid, it can be really tedious to try and fix everything that's not lined up on that grid. So make sure you're happy before you start. All right, so let's start creating this. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the base, so the floor basically. So if we grab our rectangle tool right here, and if we try to create a rectangle, you can kind of see that it's just made a regular old rectangle. It's not really done anything. The grid isn't really being used. There's 2 ways we can do this. We can either create the shape that we want. If we go to our isometric tools right here, we select enable planes. You may already have that already enabled. So if you see these 3 boxes, you're already a step ahead. If you don't, make sure you hit edit planes. And we want to select the top. So right now we're selecting the top of everything. So everything will be flat. Right now what we want to do is we want to fit this to the top of the plane. So we simply select fit to plane. And now you can see that our rectangle is fit to the top of our grid. Now what's really important with this is that we also need to enable snapping tools, and I don't mean just the magnet at the top here. If we go down to the drop down on here, make sure that you've got snap to grid ticked, because if you don't, it's going to become a lot more difficult to line things up on these grids. We've got that selected, so that means now everything that we create will snap to our isometric grid, and it just will make things a lot easier. So now we can edit this as big as we want, and we'll just try and make sure that everything is lined up to the grid. Cool, so we've got our base down. Next, what we want to do is we want to create the road. So again, grab another rectangle tool. Now again, if we draw with this, we'll just create a regular old rectangle. So we can either create the rectangles and create everything that we want and then go to each section and go fit to plane constantly, or what we can do is select edit in plane. Now when you select that, anything that you create will be created in the plane that you've selected, which is here, either the top, side, or the front. So what we can do now is with our rectangle tool, now that we've got edit in plane selected, if we create something, you can see it actually creates it within that plane, making things just a little bit easier. So if we're going to create this road, we'll give it a roadish color, and we can just move this along, snapping it to where we want it to be. So I think we'll leave it somewhere like that. And to make this a little bit more interesting, we'll add another one. So if we hit Control and J to duplicate this, and we'll just spin this around, and we'll add another road right there. And we'll make this a bit smaller. So we'll make it kind of like a T-junction sort of thing. There we go. So keeping things simple, keeping it basic, because we're going to build upon this as we go. So now that we got our road, before we add the detail to the road, you really want to plan out everything that you want to create, especially when you're making a town like this. So let's start with a building, for example. So again, we're still in our top plane. We're going to grab our rectangle tool, and we're just going to create a rectangle about that big. All right, so now that we've got that in place, we're going to create the sides of the building as well. So if we simply go to side, you'll see that the grid actually changes, and it gives us an ability to follow these grids a lot easier. So if we use this base as a guideline, select one of the corners, create our rectangle, and go up, you'll see we're creating the side of the building. And then if we go to the front, again, use the base as a guideline, make our big rectangle, and we can make that. Now, instead of making the top of this, because it'll just be another rectangle, you can't actually see the base anymore. So if we select the base just in our layer panel, and simply by holding shift to keep everything aligned to the grid, we simply just drag that all the way to the top, and we got ourselves a building. You know what? I'm going to turn these grid lines down a little bit, just because they are getting a bit in the way. So we've got ourselves a pretty decent building. Now, what's really cool with this is that if you group all these layers together, so if we grab the 3 layers of the building there and hit Control and G and group this together, we've now got our building. And it's really important, especially when making a highly detailed thing, to make sure you label your layers, because this can get really difficult really quickly. Now that we got this group, we can actually create this into an asset. So if we drag this into our assets panel, we now have an ability to just create a building out of nowhere very quickly. So let's plan this out a little better. We'll go to the top so we can map out where we're going to add some buildings. So if we simply copy this across, so we'll just hold Control and just drag this over to here. We'll keep those 2 like that. In fact, we'll move them a little bit more forwards just to keep them centered. Duplicate one over to here. And let's say we want to change this to make it a more smaller building. So what we can do, selecting this front panel, all we do is bring it down to the bottom, select the side, go down, and just simply bring the top down to create the lid. And we've just created a smaller building. Right, now that we've got this smaller building, we can just copy this across, and maybe we want to make a street of buildings. So we'll just copy this multiple times just to make a bunch of buildings. In fact, we'll leave the last one out. We're always ensuring that we've got everything lined up to the grid just to make sure it's even. There we go. And then down here, what we'll do is we'll create a different kind of building. So again, selecting one of these, if we duplicate this across, and this time what we'll do is we'll make the side of this wider. So if we select the side plane and then simply just follow this across, make it longer just as easily. Selecting top, we can extend the top. We'll quickly just make the road a little bit darker so it doesn't blend in with the buildings. And what I want to do is extend this top over like that, kind of like a canopy. And canopies obviously need something to hold it up. So if we duplicate this side, we can also line that up on here, and then we'll make this smaller. And then similarly, we'll duplicate this edge here, line that up, and then we'll make this side smaller as well. We've kind of got just like a pole kind of sticking out. And then all we'll do is we'll grab these 2, duplicate them as well, and then put it on the other side. And just like that, we've got ourselves like a canopy. So now that we've got our plan in place, we can go super wild with how detailed we want to make this by adding things like windows, roof ornaments, different styles of roofs, different styles of buildings. We can change the building shapes, all these sorts of things. So how crazy you get with this is entirely up to you. So what we'll do is we'll add some detail to these buildings. So we'll add some simple windows. So just on this building that we've got right here, what we'll do to make things a little bit easier, we'll grab this plane and just make it a little bit darker, just to make it a bit more obvious of which rectangle we're working on. Right now we're working on this front face here, and all we want to do is add a simple window. All we'll do is grab this rectangle tool and just make a simple rectangle, just like that. And we've basically created ourselves a window. We can duplicate this across, put it in the center, duplicate it again. Now, if we want to make this kind of really nice, if we grab these 3 windows, head up to the alignment menu and just click this separate horizontally. So that means it'll align them so they're equally distanced apart. It'll just look nicer in the end. Now, if we pop that in the center like that, and then if we just duplicate this down, grabbing all 3, and then if you really want to, we can actually make this one into a door, something like that. Very simply, we've actually made a decent looking window set. So now that a layer panel is getting a bit complicated, if we grab all these windows and group them together, and remember, label your layers, windows. Now you might think what we can do is actually just duplicate this and attach it to the side of this panel as well. We can try that. So let's just change the color of these windows. So if we grab this whole group, duplicate it, place it where we want it to be. Now you would think that if you select side and then fit to plane, it would work, but it doesn't. Because they're grouped, it doesn't really work like that. All it's done is it's aligned the group rather than the individual windows. So if we undo that, what you would need to do is basically select all the windows and then hit fit to plane. Now they actually line up like that. And we don't really need 2 doors, so we can delete that door. We'll select these bottom 3 and just duplicate that one further down. There we go. Simple looking building. Looks pretty cool. What I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to extend these buildings to make them a bit more like houses. We're going to make them a little bit less square and boxy, make them a bit more rectangular. If we do want to add a roof to this, what we can actually do very easily, if we grab our rectangle tool and we're looking at the side here, which is this panel here, if you're ever unsure and you start drawing something and you realize you've drawn it on the wrong one, keeping that selected, you can just hit the other plane that you want to use and just hit fit to plane, and you can always just kind of readjust what you think actually you really wanted. And in fact, because roofs usually overhang, we'll actually overhang this a little bit just like that. And with most roofs, it looks the same on the other side. So we'll add that to the other side as well, make it a bit darker so it's easier to see. Now, rather than using another shape this time, what we'll do is we'll use the pen tool. So if we grab the pen tool, if we click on the top of this triangle here, and then simply go to the top of the other triangle, we go down to the bottom of this triangle, over to this side, and back up to the top, we've basically made a rectangle. But rather than creating one, creating it into curves, and then just kind of bending it into the place, we can just do it this way. It can just be easier, and we'll give this roof a little bit of color actually. Something like that. Now we do need one on the other side as well. So again, if we grab the pen tool, head up to the top here, go to the top of the back triangle, go to the bottom of the back triangle, bottom of the front triangle, create our shape, and then we'll give it the same color we've got here. In fact, we'll make it slightly darker, seeing as it's the other side of the roof. And there we go. And there we have a pretty cool looking roof. So you want to work smart instead of hard. If we're going to make a row of these buildings, we could just delete all the other buildings and copy this across. Or we could just grab all these shapes and just duplicate this across like that. There we go, just line it up just like that. Got ourselves a nice row of houses. How about down here? What can we do with this? What we'll do is we'll make this into like a park sort of area. So in fact, we will grab this and we'll just move it back a little bit. So because isometric towns are usually pretty simple in terms of how things look, so all we want to do with this we're going to make a green patch of grass. We make our rectangle. You can see we're not in the right plane here. So we're going to go back over to the top, head down to fit to plane. So now that we are basically creating the floor of this, we can now create a nice green patch and then send it all the way to the bottom. You can see our layer panel is getting pretty complicated. So I'm going to close a bunch of these groups. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is actually you can use text within this isometric tool as well. So for example, if we go over to this front section here, so we're going to basically have some writing at the top of this. If we select our text tool and we just draw a frame on this side here, and then we'll write in something like park and dine. We'll call it like a diner or something as well. Make this a little bit bigger, center it, so we can align this text right here, and then we'll change the text as well. Now, obviously, when you look at this, it looks quite flat, so we obviously want to make that look a little bit more 3D. So what we'll do is we'll change that text to white. And a really easy way of doing this, especially with text, is actually going into the effects library and giving this a bevel. And if we go to inner bevel and just changing these values a little bit, you can see we can make a decent looking 3D sort of text. Make sure we got the shadow in the right places. So we'll make the shadow kind of towards the back. Everything we've kind of made the back of this look a little bit more shadowy. We want to make the back of this writing more shadowy, so we'll pop that down this way here. And then just by changing this a little bit, softening it out, we can create some nice 3D-esque text. So I mean, those are the techniques that you'd be using to making a town like this. It's kind of rinse and repeat from here to make kind of how you want the rest of the buildings to look. How much detail you want to put into it is, again, it's entirely up to you how far you want to go. If you do search online for isometric grid, you'll find some really cool ones, so you can take them as inspiration and try to recreate them as well. But really, the one thing to remember is that once you know what plane you're meant to be in, things become a whole lot easier. And if you're in the wrong one, you can always change it again. It's not the hardest. So I would recommend kind of trialing it out, create something that you can, even if you're copying something to begin with, as long as you don't pass it off as your own. It is really good practice, and you'll be making kind of really cool isometric things really easily. So I hope you liked this video. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe for more videos like this. If you do make an isometric town yourself, then make sure you tag me in either Twitter or Instagram. It'd be really cool to see what kind of things you guys make up. If you did like this video, then you might want to check out this one right here. And as always, I've been Brown Bear. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.